Growing up in the 16-bit era, the Sega Genesis was my platform of choice. I actually didn't play the Super Nintendo till I was much older. The Sega Genesis was what I wanted, and thankfully my parents got it for me. So I decided, you know what, I've been on a Sega kick lately. We've been talking about lots of Sega stuff on the channel. It is time to do the Sega Genesis Hidden Gems video. Now, with any Hidden Gems video on this channel, one thing I always keep in mind is price point. I don't like watching a Hidden Gems video and then finding out all of these games are super expensive. I think the most expensive game on this list is only like 30 bucks, so that's definitely very reasonable. So sit back, relax, subscribe, and learn about some Sega Genesis games you might not know about, or maybe just games you passed up. Without any further ado, let's get into my Sega Genesis Hidden Gems.
When you think of the Sega Genesis, you probably don't think of the first-person shooter genre. Surprisingly though, there's actually a really fun one on the Genesis called Zero Tolerance. The story is pretty cliche, aliens, humans that are brainwashed, outer space, but the game really provides a solid first-person shooting experience on the Genesis. With a variety of characters to choose from, and you could select another one to die to keep progressing, the game really offers something unique. The graphics are pretty smooth, and the frame rate is surprisingly decent. The craziest thing about this game though is the ability to link two Genesis consoles together and play two-player co-op. Each player does need a TV and whatnot, but still, it's pretty impressive to see this running on 16-bit hardware. Zero Tolerance is a unique game, and since it's cheap as hell, you probably want to check out this primitive but fun first-person shooter on the Genesis. .3D fighters were becoming huge in the mid-90s with games like Tekken and Battle Arena Toshinden, but my favorite was always Virtua Fighter. As a huge fan of the arcade games, and after lusting the 32X and Saturn games, I remember seeing Virtua Fighter 2 for the Genesis as a kid and being blown away that a 3D fighter could be on the Genesis. I then realized it wasn't the Virtua Fighter I knew, and it was a 2D fighter, and I actually never played it until I was an adult. Virtua Fighter 2 for the Genesis is actually a solid fighter though, if you can look past the fact that it's actually Virtua Fighter 1, but named differently for some reason. The gameplay still feels a lot like Virtua Fighter though, being easy to control but difficult to master. All of the moves are in the game as well, and the animation is pretty solid for the most part. Don't let the fact that they made a 3D fighter into a 2D fighter turn you off though, as Virtua Fighter 2 is cheap but a fun fighter on the Genesis. The 16-bit era had a lot of great platformers, but one game that seems to be overlooked is Quackshot. What happens when you take a film franchise like Indiana Jones and mix it with Donald Duck? Well, you get Quackshot. A lot of the Disney games looked fantastic on the Genesis, and Quackshot is no exception, with great animation, parallax scrolling in the backgrounds, and interesting enemy variety. The game is a puzzle platformer, and while most of the puzzles are pretty easy, it's still a nice deviation of the gameplay. Donald can also eat a bunch of red peppers and become invincible for a short period of time as well. If you're a fan of puzzle platformers or Disney animation games in general, Quackshot is another must-own for the Sega Genesis. Cheeky Cheeky Boys was a game I actually wasn't familiar with until a YouTube friend, Retro Games Vinyl and Beer, suggested I check it out when I was telling him I was doing this video. And honestly, I'm glad I did, as Cheeky Cheeky Boys is a pretty solid platformer for the Sega Genesis. Originally an arcade title, Cheeky Cheeky Boys, or Mega Twins depending on where you live, has you playing as one of two twins who are trying to reclaim their homeland, which has been trashed by monsters. While this version of the game loses the two-player co-op mode of the arcade version, the game is otherwise pretty close to the original source material. The game has a lot of charm and character in the design of it, so if you're looking for a solid platformer with bright and colorful visuals, Cheeky Cheeky Boys is a solid pickup. Alright, this is obviously the most well-known game on the list, but I still feel like people overlooked it because, well, it's not a traditional Sonic game. Sonic Spinball was the first Sonic spin-off game, and as the title suggests, it is a pinball game. Well, the game doesn't really retain any elements from the Sonic games, although you do have to defeat Robotnik, or Eggman as he's called nowadays by the kids, and you do collect rings. Sonic Spinball deviates from the standard pinball titles though, by having huge sprawling levels instead of just a standalone single-screen table. One area I really like about Sonic Spinball is the music, with funky tracks that probably should have been in a mainline Sonic game instead of being regulated to a side game. The pinball mechanics are pretty solid, although it can be sometimes a bit frustrating when you need to get to a certain area on the level but can't seem to do it. Considering this game is often under $5, it's definitely worth checking out because honestly, you've probably passed on it a million times. Speaking of Sonic, one genre that I'm surprised never became a thing on the Genesis was Sonic clones. You would think that people would want to cash in on the Sonic craze with the super fast platformer game, but no one ever really did. Well, no one except for Vic Tokai, who released Socket. You play as a time-traveling duck named Socket in a game that clearly is inspired by Sonic the Hedgehog. And by inspired, I mean rips off, but that's not really a bad thing. The levels are broken up into high-speed levels and levels that require more exploration and a slower pace, which is actually pretty interesting. Socket looks pretty decent, and the music sounds like a love letter to Sonic games as well. Socket doesn't do anything really well, but it doesn't do anything really bad either, and considering the price tag is definitely worth checking out if you're a Sonic fan looking for something a little bit different on the Sega Genesis. Shmup games were pretty plentiful on the Genesis, with most commanding a high price tag nowadays, but one that is still very reasonably priced and often overlooked is Biohazard Battle. A side-scrolling shooter, Biohazard Battle has you choosing from one of 4 ships, each with their own unique abilities, and exploring various levels blowing up enemies. The game actually lets you block incoming attacks too, which is a bit different from most shmups where you have to just avoid them. With tons of power-ups on the levels, bright and colorful graphics, and a really bass-heavy soundtrack with some good tunes, Biohazard Battle is a pretty straightforward but fun shmup game. Treasure is often known for their games such as Gunstar Heroes on the Genesis, but an often overlooked game of theirs is Light Crusader. An action RPG that is pretty reminiscent of games like Landstalker, Light Crusader uses that same sort of isometric view. The gameplay is pretty straightforward, buying items and equipment from various locations and towns, and then traversing dungeons that feature puzzles, most of which aren't too hard to solve. The highlight of the game though is by far the graphics, which are some of the best I've seen on the Genesis, with lots of colors and rich detailed backgrounds. The goal of the game is to rescue kidnapped people, and has a pretty good pace in terms of the gameplay progressing throughout the dungeons. The isometric view is a bit confusing at times though, and can result in some cheap hits, but for the most part, Light Crusader is a very enjoyable action RPG that I definitely recommend you check out. One of my favorite cartoons growing up was Garfield and Friends. When it was announced that Garfield was getting his own Genesis game, I was pretty excited as a kid and remember getting Garfield Caught in the act for one of my birthdays. The game has you playing as Garfield, who gets sucked into a TV one night after breaking it. The game has you going through themed areas such as a Dracula level or my favorite, one based on Casablanca. Characters from the show such as Odie and John make cameos as characters throughout the game. The animation for Garfield Caught in the Act though is top notch, and arguably has some of the best visuals on the Genesis for a side-scrolling platformer. The game is a bit short with only 6 levels, but it's a blast to play while it lasts. If you're a fan of Garfield or side-scrolling platformers, Caught in the Act is a definite must-own. Mortal Kombat made violent fighters a household staple, but in my opinion, the original games don't hold up that well in modern times. One violent fighter that is often overlooked is Weapon Lord, though. Weapon Lord is a weapons-based 2D fighter with lots of violence, fatalities, and pretty interesting characters. The gameplay still holds up today as well, with a blocking system that helps you parry your opponent's attacks. Weapon Lord is unique in that it was designed with home consoles in mind and wasn't a simple arcade port like most fighters were at the time. With a good variety of characters and pretty deep gameplay, Weapon Lord is a fantastic fighter that people need to try out. It's sometimes cited as the basis for Soul Calibur, and considering Namco published the game, there's a good chance that this was an inspiration for that awesome fighting series. If you like bloody fighters with great gameplay, pick up Weapon Lord, and you won't be disappointed.
So those are just a handful of Sega Genesis Hidden Gems. Now I do leave some games off the list because I like to have the potential to do a sequel in the future. So if you feel like I missed something or you didn't know about some of these games and you plan on checking them out, let me know in the comments section down below. And as always, thank you for watching this video. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Check out other videos on the channel. If you really like my face, check out my Patreon page. And if you really feel inclined, send me some friend mail. The P.O. box is in the description box down below. I'll catch you guys next time. Later.